Hi, everybody. So in preparing for this talk, I decided to take another look at the data landscape, because it's been a long time since I've done this stuff. And sure enough, things have really changed. I don't know if you've noticed how strangely bucolic the whole world of big data is, right? You have the data streams that all flow past the data logs into the data lake, which is a new arrival for me. And then there's the data silo that stands by the old data warehouse, where Grandpa used to sling his bits. High above it all, you see there floats the cloud. And eventually, you surmise that this all kind of ends up somewhere in the digital ocean. Today, I'd like to challenge this picture and ask you for the next 15 minutes to think about data as this evil, radioactive, waste product sludge that none of us actually know how to safely contain. In particular, I would like to draw a parallel between our industry and the troubled industry of nuclear energy, which is another one of these technologies that never quite managed to figure out how to separate the beneficial uses from the malevolent ones. A singular problem that nuclear power had is that it generated these deadly waste products. They're kind of picturesque when they're in the swimming pool where they live, but afterwards you have to figure out what to do with them. The problem is their lifespan is longer than that of any institution that we can figure out to guard them with. So you have these strange plans for how to safeguard this from people ever touching it or eating it, because it'll kill them. Kooky ideas like let's all put it in a giant hole in the ground or hollow out a mountain and then put a crazy sculpture on top that people will recognize as a sign to stay away. Don't dig up and eat what you find here. Landscape of thorns. And we never ended up solving this problem. Now, the data that we're all collecting around people has the same really odd property. It has a lifespan that's just longer than any institution that manages it. Tech companies, they come and they go. They have a short lifespan. And it doesn't help that we're constantly trading and selling and repackaging this data and giving it to one another. But the data itself lives on for years and retains its potency. It has the same lifetime as a human lifespan because it involves people's lives. And sometimes it it can affect people's children. So you have two human lifetimes you have to contend with. Nuclear waste always came in those two flavors. You know, you had the high energy, obviously bad, spent fuel that was fairly concentrated, but then you had all this bulky stuff, contaminated soil, coveralls, all of the things that you collect when you have trash in a nuclear power plant all across the country. You end up with bags and bags of this stuff, and no real plan for where to put it or how to keep it. So similarly, we have data that is very sensitive and we recognize is very sensitive, people's private emails, their financial records, their health records, but then we also have this vast mass of bulk that we're collecting that turns out to also be chock full of secrets, but we just don't guard it. Right? So for example, your fitness tracker might reveal that you're having an affair because your heart rate spikes at lunchtime in a suspicious way, right? There's all these devices now that are location aware or talk to their friend devices that are location aware, so you can track people's movements decades after the fact, something we've never been able to do before, right? And then you have things like predictive search engines, where people type random stuff into text fields, or they paste something by mistake. They type their password into the search box. If you happen to be tracking that and throwing it into your data lake in hopes of going fishing later, then you're inadvertently kind of storing this very sensitive data that you might not even know is in the system. In a world where everything is tracked and kept forever, you become hostage to the worst thing you've ever done, right? Or the most embarrassing thing you've ever done. And the people who have that information about you have great power over you, whether or not they choose to exercise it, right? And yet, you know, we've been treating this data with the utmost carelessness, like it held no power whatsoever. Eric Schmidt of Google has a great idea. You know, he says, if you don't have anything to hide, then you don't worry about this world and no privacy. And in principle, he's right, but there's one problem, which is sometimes you don't know in advance what is going to be bad, right? Consider the world of Hollywood in the 1940s. You know, we were at war with Nazi Germany. Our best friends and allies, the Soviet Union, were fighting at our side. And people in Hollywood, as they always are, liked progressive causes, and they hung out with communists and socialists, and they had a grand old time. And 10 years later, it turned out that any proof of that would destroy your career. You ended up on a blacklist. You know, imagine if we had Instagram back then. What would have happened? Right? Closer to our time, consider the hypothetical example. You're gay, you live in Moscow. In 2004, you decide you want to start a LiveJournal. LiveJournal is an American company that lets you run an online diary. Everything seems to be going well, but in 2007, LiveJournal gets sold to a Russian company. No problem. Except that soon thereafter, for some reason, God knows what, the Russian authorities decide they're going to pursue a grand campaign of homophobia. It's now the official state policy, and you live with this knot of fear in your stomach. Okay? Or closer to home, the NYPD is doing massive online surveillance of young black men based on what city block they live on, following them on social media. They're putting up these creepy guard towers by mosques. And I don't mean to pick on our government. This kind of this stuff happens all over the place. Michael Hayden, the former director of the CIA and the NSA, has said that, as a direct quote, "We kill people based on metadata." He's really kind of doing his best to become this Bond figure, and he's got the look going for him too. But it's true. Like, when you store this information, are you prepared for that level of responsibility? That, do you take it as seriously as the governments that try to get to it? And like I said, I don't want to pick on any one individual government. Everybody has a bad run once in a while. You go through a golden age, and then you end up with a Caligula or a Stephen Harper. In the long run, all governments are basically evil at some point. And you don't have to spin fantastical scenarios of an American dictatorship, FEMA concentration camps, or whatever you want. All you have to ask yourself is 4 letters, okay? WWND. What would Nixon do? We have the stellar example in our recent past, well within the lifetime of the data that we're safeguarding, of someone who just had great criminal instincts. Nixon was a man who was so bad, he didn't just wiretap his enemies, he wiretapped himself. He hired psychopaths whose plan was to bomb the Brookings Institution. He hired other psychopaths who broke into a safe to try to steal psychiatric records from one of his enemies. The man was motivated. So I want you to go through a visualization exercise with me, all right? Nixon's in your data center. He's got the laptop out, all right? He's logging in. He's got root. What does he find? All right? And if you're not breaking into a cold sweat, then congratulations. You're a good steward of data. But if you're worried about this, tricky dick in your data center scares you, then think about what you're saving. All right? So we heard earlier today what a good job we're doing teaching the government to spy on us, right? If we weren't collecting all this data, if we didn't have an entire business built around it, we weren't filling the Javits Center because of it, the government would never dare to build giant data centers and collect all this information about its own citizens. It would stick out like a sore thumb. But we're enabling. We're enabling. That's it for the harm that surveillance culture does to others. All right, let's talk about, stuff we care about. How does it hurt me? Well, data has this odd effect on us. You can't just set up this elaborate infrastructure and then ignore its findings and decide that, maybe this big data thing wasn't what you were looking for. The data pipelines, they take on an institutional life of their own. And it doesn't really help that people speak about the data-driven business like they're talking about the Christ-centered life in these almost religious tones of fervor. The data mindset really is good for some questions, but it's terrible and completely inadequate for others. But the promise you're told is that enough data is going to lead you to insight. Just retain the data indefinitely and maybe, waterboard it a little so it gives up its secrets and it'll spit it all out for you. But there's a con. There's a con going on here. Like on the data side, they tell you, hey, just collect everything, collect all of the data, and we have these magical algorithms that will find everything in it for you. But on the algorithms side, where I am, they tell us, just throw any code you have at it. We have this awesome training data, and there's enough of it that you're sure to surface something interesting. What's lacking from the process completely is any type of insight or wisdom. There's not really even any domain knowledge. There's just this grand sausage-making process that's supposed to apply equally across any industry. One size fits all. Right? I think there should be a law that every Hadoop cluster that is installed needs to have a framed photograph of Robert McNamara hanging above it. All right? This is a reminder to us of the dangers of the data religion. This is a fundamentally decent, intelligent, and reflective man who got so caught up in his own dashboard that he forgot to look out the window. And what happened to the country as a result was an unmitigated disaster. I worry that one reason we haven't learned from the fiasco of the 60s, the systems analysis, the fetishizing of data, is because, after all, it's only anecdotal. There's only the one data point. But the history is there, and I encourage anybody to go back and study it. You'll learn immensely. I want to tell you one final scary story, the scariest of them all, which is that maybe this data stuff is actually being counterproductive. It's making things worse for us than better. In the pharmaceutical industry, there's something called Eroom's law. Eroom's law is just Moore's law spelled backwards. And it's the observation that since 1950, every 9 years, the number of discoveries per $1 billion in research spending has been cut in half. This is not a linear graph, this is an exponential curve. So just like Moore's law goes up like a hockey stick, this is going down like a hockey stick. And 2 cents spent in 1950 buys you the same amount of research as $1 today. This is an astonishing result because basically the entire science that pharmaceuticals are based around was invented since that time. You have everything you can think of, genetics, sequencing, all this mechanization, understanding of biochemistry, enzymes, how the body works, you name it, and it was discovered in the interim. And yet somehow we haven't even stayed at the same level, we've gotten worse. Every step in the drug discovery pipeline has been optimized, sometimes by orders of magnitude. Many of them have been mechanized and made completely automatic and put under computer control. And yet we are 80 times worse at discovering drugs on a cost basis than we were back then, right? You can make excuses. You can say, well, maybe the regulatory environment is really much more strict now, or all the easy drugs were found early. But even so, that doesn't account for this difference. At the very worst, it should have stayed about the same. How did it get bad? The basic fact is that a chain-smoking chemist just randomly shooting compounds into mice is a more cost-effective way to discover drugs than an entire genomics data center. That is a bizarre result. Huh? I think of what's happening here is that in natural systems, you don't have these nice independent variables. Everything is messy and really, really interconnected. In computer science, we're taught to fear any sort of self-modification, anything that loops back in on itself, because it rapidly becomes a hairball. We have all these pejorative terms, spaghetti code, to describe what happens when data becomes self-referential and acts upon itself. But nature never got the memo. It's chock full of these systems. And what I think is going to happen is that as we start applying these data insights to more and more of the real world, we'll keep running into the same problem, hopefully not at the same terrific cost as the pharmaceutical industry, which is having to reevaluate its whole discovery process. But it really may turn out that directed iterative search, aka that chemist with a syringe and an analytical mind and a laptop to do little experiments on, is a more effective way to search these enormous data spaces of real-world data than any amount of machine learning trickery. Right? And then human beings. Human beings always ruin everything, right? As soon as your model of the world starts to include human beings, all bets are off. Because they're not dumb and they're going to notice what you're modeling and react to it. There's a famous apocryphal anecdote of, Chelyabinsk No. 5 nail factory in the 1960s where they had the 5-year plan, and in the first year they were told that they were going to be evaluated on the number of nails they produced. So, of course, they made 150 million of the tiniest useless nails possible. Well, the comrades got wise to this and decided the next year they were going to evaluate based on weight and not count. So Chelyabinsk nail factory then produced the world's largest nail, fulfilling its quota, and round we go. There's a less fictional and more recent example that I like, which is in the trucking industry. You have these electronic data locators, vehicle locators. And they enforce things like how much time you can drive between a rest period. But what do you do when you're 10 miles away from a motel and your time is up? Truckers discovered that this only measures your speed once every minute, at the top of the minute. So what they do is you can drive 45 miles an hour, and then you slow down right before the minute, and then you speed back up. And as long as you stay below the threshold of 10 miles an hour on the minute mark, you're fine. You can go as far as you want. So you have these exhausted truckers looking at their cell phones as they drive slowly, stop and go on the highway late at night. Well, you may say, well, this is easily fixed technically, right? We're just going to measure every second. But notice what you've started to do. Instead of just measuring the world, now you're in this adversarial relationship with another human being, and you've introduced issues of power and agency and control that weren't there before. You thought you were getting a better idea of what is happening in reality, but you've actually just introduced an additional layer between yourself and reality. And this kind of thing happens over and over again. The kind of arms races that I'm talking about are a symptom of data disease. We've seen them reach the point of absurdity in the online advertising industry, which unfortunately is also the economic cornerstone of the web. Advertisers have built a huge surveillance apparatus, following their dream of perfect knowledge, but only to find that it's turned into a hall of mirrors where they can't even distinguish people from automated traffic. I think of this all as the Jetsons fallacy, right? Where you think that you can utterly transform the world with technology, but the people and social relationships and culture is going to stay the same as it was, recognizably so. And of course, that's not true. As soon as you start modeling people, monitoring people, people react, and react in surprising ways. Here's the bottom line I have. Your industry is too scary, all right? We haven't broken ground on a new nuclear power plant in the United States since 1973, right? Even now that we have safe reactor designs that physically can't melt down, we have a lot more experience in operating reactors, and that we desperately need fuels that don't emit carbon. It doesn't help. People are spooked. They saw the people running around in bunny suits on a Pennsylvania island, and that was it for them. That was the end of nuclear power. And I have to remind you that radioactivity used to be really, really cool. Like, it had its heyday. I mean, one of the first things we discovered about it is that it fought cancer. We had radium face powder. We had radioactive toothpaste. We had delicious radium chocolate, right? Who can't remember the cool, satisfying flavor of a radium cigarette, right? And you had your radium condoms that glowed in the dark, and of course they went well with your radium underpants. Right now, we're in the radium underpants stage, right? Much of what we're working on is silly, some of it is useful, and some of it is downright harmful. There are people in this audience who are working on our version of the radium cigarette, okay? Now you're thinking, okay, Maciej, in 12 minutes of sophistry and labored analogies, you've convinced me that my entire professional life is a lie. What should I do now? Well, I want to make you believe that data collection is a trade-off. It's not just a paradise. It hurts the people whose data you collect, but it also hurts your ability to think clearly. Make sure that it's worth it. I'm not going to claim that the sponsors of this conference are selling you a bill of goods. I'm just going to heavily imply it. All right? My advice to you is this. When it comes to data, number one, don't collect it. All right? Just don't collect it. On the similar principle that if you don't have any money, you're not going to get mugged or worry about getting mugged. If you don't collect the data, you have no problems. Switch from the hoarding mentality of let's keep everything we can to the mentality of let's just use what we need, perhaps nothing. Your marketing team will love you. They can tell the world that you care about privacy. Right? If you have to collect it, don't store it. All right? Just don't store it. Think in terms of flows and sampling instead of stocks and mining. What sounds cooler to you, right? Flows and sampling, that sounds like hip-hop. That's kind of cool. Stocks and mining, come on. So, figure out how much you can do with ephemeral data. And there's kind of a bonus. If you can convince and reliably promise to users that you are using ephemeral data, you really aren't storing it, they will be willing to give you much more. All right? If they trust you, then you can do all sorts of cool things that you can't do now because people don't want it to be kept forever. All right? And finally, if you have to store it, don't keep it. Don't keep it forever. Don't sell it to Axiom. All right? Don't put it in Amazon Glacier and forget the password and that it's even there. Don't do any of these things. All right? I've argued that there should be a law that limits behavioral data collection to 90 days. It's not because I want to ruin Christmas for your children and your families, but because I think it's actually going to be better for us as a society and that it will improve the quality of data that we do get. When people know that it's not kept forever, they will be willing to not game the system as much to protect themselves. All right? And finally, don't be surprised. All right? The current model of total surveillance and permanent storage is not tenable. If we keep it up, we're going to have our own version of 3 Mile Island, some widely publicized failure that galvanizes popular opinion against the technology. And then people who are angry, mistrustful, and may not understand anything about computers will regulate your industry into the ground. Right? You will be left like those poor saps in the nuclear reactors who can't sharpen a pencil without filling out a form in triplicate. You don't want that to happen. Even I don't want that to happen. We can have this radiant future, but it's going to require self-control, circumspection, and much more concern for safety than we've been willing so far to show. It's time that we all take a deep breath and pull off our radium underpants. I want to thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Big Data conference.